Welcome to the 12th in my series of video articles on how to write short stories. This is the second part of a three-part look at Dan Wells' 7-point story structure, and in this video article we're going to be looking at blending that 7-point story structure with the story types as identified by Damon Knight that we looked at earlier in the series. Quick overview stroke recap of the 7-point structure. The 7-point structure setup of the hook, which is the setup, the plot turn, the inciting incident, the pinch point 1, which is escalating tension, the midpoint, pinch point 2, which is then escalating tension between the midpoint or conflict between the midpoint and the final plot turn, which leads to the resolution stroke climax. Remember that Dan Wells based the 7-point structure on something that he found in the Star Trek Narrator's Guide, and remember that the way that they, and therefore he, suggested to use this structure was you would start at the resolution, then go to the midpoint, then go to the hook and the plot turn, and then work forwards from there. We'll just quickly have an overview stroke recap of Damon Knight's story types. There's the decision story, where a decision at the end of the story is the important story driver. There's the explanation story, where something is revealed at the end of the story that explains all of the things that have gone before. There's the resolution story, where again what happens in the climax of the story resolves the story problem that started at the beginning of the story. There's the revelation story, where a revelation at the end of the story makes sense of everything that's come before. And then there's the solution story, where a problem is set up at the start of the story, which is then solved in the climax of the story. There's a separate video on each of those, plus there's an overview video which summarizes each of those as well. So do remind yourself of all that information. Now, the important thing about Damon Knight's story types and blending it with Dan Wells' story model leads us to a key point, and that is that the story types determine what drives your story, and the 7-point structure determines how that drive unfolds. This is an important distinction to get your head around, and those of you who are interested in other story models may already have a preference for, say, Dan Harmon's Story Circle or Hero's Journey or whatever it is. The story types determining the driver of the story applies for those story models as well, and we'll see that in future articles in this series. So I'll just repeat that because it's an important point. The story types determine what drives your story, and the 7-point structure determines how that drive unfolds. So knowing your story types is really important, because you don't want to have a climax of a story which is the climax for a solution story, but then your inciting incident is setting up the disclosure of a revelation. So it helps keep your story focused as to what type it should be. Audience will have their own expectations, whether they're casual readers or whether they're writer readers as well, and they'll have their own expectations built up on their own experiences with stories, both in written form and in visual form, TVs, movies, those kind of things. There's a second key point to look at. At the midpoint, which the original Star Trek guide that Dan Wells leaned on, they emphasized that as the point upon which a complete episode, or story in our case, is balanced. And here's the key point. That midpoint changes its function depending on which story type you are going with. So, for example, if we look at the story types again, in a decision story, the midpoint becomes the point where the moral choice is made or becomes really imperative. The explanation story, the midpoint provides the organizing context that when the explanation is revealed will make it all add up and have sense. In the resolution story, the midpoint is an event which enables character breakthrough which will appear in the climax of the story. In the revelation story, the midpoint gives some partial truths which help set up the final revelation. And in the solution story, the midpoint provides key insight that makes the final solution possible. Now, again, what I mentioned in the previous slide, knowing the type of story that you're telling changes the kind of event you use for the midpoints and for inciting incidents as well. So it's really important to determine which kind of story you're writing, and then only then do you start, when you're outlining, filling in plot points, do you then start filling those in, because the story type will affect all of those points, the important points of the story, the midpoint, the climax point, the inciting incident, and the hook as well. So you really need to know your story type as almost one of the first things. There's a third key point. The story type flavors and guides every one of the 7 structure points of the story model. Plus, you can use it as a diagnostic tool to make sure that everything lines up with the right kind of story type that you've got. And if you use Dan Wells' method of working from the climax, the story climax, and you get the climax and the midpoint and the inciting incident all matched up with the story type, then that makes your story, your story's got a good chance at actually ending and working, because all of the dynamic elements needed to get the reader from the beginning to the end should all align, and the reader's expectation will be set by the hook and the inciting incident. And what you don't want to do is give them a hook or an inciting incident where they think it's like a standard detective murder mystery, and then in the climax of the story, the detective has a choice whether to kill the murderer himself or let him go free. And that's a different kind of story. And if you're telling that kind of story, and I've seen those kind of stories told, you need to have that set up in the inciting incident. So, a quick caveat. With the 7-point story structure, since I filmed the previous video, I've done some work on outlining some stories and seeing exactly how it would lay out on the page. And I think for most short stories, and we're talking about the 5,000 to 6,000 word mark, a 5-point structure might be better. And that has the hook, it has the plot turn, it has the midpoint, it has the second plot turn, and then it has the resolution. So you lose those pinch points. And then if you decide you want to expand the story and go to slightly longer detail, you can then add one or both of those pinch points back in. So that's what I wanted to speak about in this video. In the next episode, I'm going to look at actually outlining a story, and I'm going to use a workflow that I developed by blending the story types with the 7-point story structure. And what I'll do is, I think I mentioned this before, I had a story where I had a female character who had a special forces background, but she left the army and she was working in the private sector, and she was working as a cross between a glamour escort and a bodyguard. And so her USP was she pretends to be a glamour escort, but she's actually a bodyguard. And I always thought she was a great character, and I wrote this story and I used the discovery writing method, and as I've said, the story died on the page, ended up with a really down ending where I could never use that character again because she'd be in jail for murder. And I thought, well, here's a chance to use this workflow and try and rewrite the story with the salient points of the character and see if I can come up with a story with a more upbeat ending for that character, and see if this blend of story types and story structure would work. So that's what we're going to look at in the next episode. Until then, if you need to email me, you can catch me at paul@deliberate-practice.com. And if you're a frustrated and or aspiring fiction writer, it's definitely worth checking out my Writing Vault. It's a monthly membership. It's only $7 a month. You can see the URL there. It'll be linked in the description for this video article as well. There's lots of great stuff in there, including, I just put this morning, a 7-point story analysis of one of the early Sherlock Holmes stories and how that plays out according to the 7-point story structure that Dan Wells has analysed. And what's interesting is it also works with looking at it through the lens of story types as well. And there's stuff like that going in all the time. $7 a month. There's 2 or 3 bonuses you get for signing up. Go and check out the page and see what you think. And if you've got any questions on that, you can use the email address that you can see on the slide in front of you.